And it's this newest research on the historical problems with Islam's origin. Back in 1992, I was sent to Britain, to London, to work with radical Muslims. That's my area of expertise. I have a master's degree in Islamic studies. I have another master's degree in apologetics, Christian apologetics. And so I was sent there to deal with this real growing radical movement. If any of you come from Britain, you know what I'm talking about. This is the Muhajirun party. These are the Anjem Chowdhury or Sheikh Umar Bakr Muhammad, all his group, these people that were sent to join ISIS in 2014. These are the people I was asked to go work with. And so I went in 1992, and I was told the best place to find the radicals and the best place to engage with them was at a place called Speaker's Corner. Have any of you here been to Speaker's Corner? Okay, what have you noticed at Speaker's Corner? What's happening there? Go ahead, just tell me what your experience. Did you see Muslims there on a Sunday? It's only on Sundays, right? And what kind of Muslims did you meet? Were they very radical? Were they talking about Islam? No. What were they talking about? Christianity, right? No? Yes? You're not sure? And this is my experience. In 1992, I went down there and I found that almost every one of the Muslims that were there, and they dominated the corner in the afternoons. In the mornings, there were hardly any Muslims because they hadn't got up yet. But in the afternoons, they took over and everybody else left. And they came with Bibles in their hands, not Qur'ans. 25 years of working at Speaker's Corner, which I've maybe seen one or two Qur'ans in 25 years. We have the Qur'ans, they don't. And they had all these post-it notes all the way through the Qur'an with all the seeming historical anachronisms, the scientific errors, the contradictions, you name it, they had it. And I had never heard this material before because we don't teach in our seminaries and our Bible schools how to deal with that kind of confrontation. And so I realized, but why goodness, I had a master's degree in apologetics, but not Islamic apologetics. No one had taught me about all these historical anachronisms, these scientific errors, these internal contradictions. We don't get this in seminary. And I realized that I was way below the curve, and so I had to take a notebook with me. My wife, the first time I came back completely disillusioned, she says, get back out there and just take a notebook and write down the questions and learn your apologetics. And that's what I did, week after week after week for 25 years. But it was very quickly that I realized that we were doing all the defending. We weren't going on the offense. We had nothing really to go on the offense because there is no school in the world that teaches that. And the word they use for that is called polemics. Have you all heard this word? Do you know what I'm talking about? So polemics is on the offense. Apologetics is on the defense. Just like your American football teams. You have two completely different teams, do you not? An offense team and a defense. And you have two completely different skills. Apologetics we do pretty good when it comes to humanists and when it comes to atheists. In fact, there's a whole track here called apologetics, and we're under that track. Those of us who are doing Islam. But no one really knew how to go on the offense. And there's no book written about polemics. There's none at all. There's no a course that I could take. There was no one I could go to. And I didn't really know how to go on the offense. Then in 1994, I took a class at School of Oriental and African Studies under Dr. Gerald Hatun. And I went into this class of 50 students, and it was on this title, The Origins of Islam. I thought, well, that's pretty innocuous. I know the origins. I've read the Sirah. I know who, Ibn Hisham. I've read all of his material. I know who Muhammad was. I know what he did. What more is there to learn? So I went there thinking that I knew probably more than the professor. At least I wasn't going to learn too much. And the very first day he started talking, he says, we have nothing. We have no idea who Muhammad is. We have no reference to him at all in the 7th century. Are you aware of that? This man who was born in 570, was in Mecca in 570, started receiving revelations in Mecca in 610, moved to Medina in 622, and then died there in Medina in 632. So from 570 to 632, nothing was written about him at all. Not a word. I hadn't heard this before. That wasn't taught me at Fuller Seminary when I was doing my postgraduate on Islam. And then he said that everything we know about what this man said, this supposed Muhammad said, does not come from the 7th century, does not come from any eyewitness account like we have with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John and Matthew were there listening to what Jesus said. John and Matthew were there seeing what Jesus did, right? So we have eyewitness account of what Jesus said, what he did. There's his biography. There are his sayings. That's called the Sirah and the Tafsir and the Hadith of Jesus. So we've got that in loads, but we have nothing on Muhammad, nothing on Muhammad. And we're talking about 600 to 700 years later, 600 years later, we have nothing on Muhammad. Boy, I hadn't heard that before. And then all these guys, and I'm going to be going into this later on tonight, all these fellows who had written about Muhammad, so Ibn Ishaq, 765, Ibn Hisham, 833, Al-Waqidi, 835, Al-Bukhari, 870, Sahih Muslim, are you listening to the dates? You notice the dates? 765, 833, 835, 870. Muhammad died in 632. Do you see a problem there? See, I hadn't heard this before. Have you heard this before tonight? Not one word about Muhammad. Yet he was supposed to be one of the greatest men in the history of mankind. There was supposed to be a huge corpus of literature written about what he did, what he said, where he went, how he lived, and how he became the model for all of mankind. But we couldn't find one reference to him. Not one reference in the 7th century. Well, there were about 25 students who were Muslims in a group of 50 of us. And as he was saying this, he started saying other things. Do you know we can't find one mosque at all from the 7th century that's facing a city called Mecca? In fact, we can't find any reference to anywhere on this city called Mecca, that this place where Muhammad was born, the place where he actually lived, and the place which is where the Kaaba is today. I'd never heard this before. Of course, the Muslim students didn't know what to do. They'd never heard before either. In fact, everybody in the class, all 50 of us, hadn't heard this before. And then he said, when you look at that great structure in Jerusalem called the Dome of the Rock, created by Ibn al-Malik, look at that structure. Beautiful dome. You've seen pictures of it if you haven't been to Jerusalem. It stands there on the Temple Mount. He said it has no Qibla. It has no direction of prayer. Did you know that? Yet this is the third most holy shrine in Islam, and it has no direction of prayer. And I said, whoa. And then as I was listening to this, I noticed that every one of these Muslim students was getting up off their chair, walking to the door, slamming the door as they went out, and yelling some abuse at Dr. Gerald Hotting. After 2 weeks, every Muslim had left. We had no Muslims left. Half the class just got up and left, slamming the door. And I started looking at this and I said, this is amazing. Well, here's a polemic I can use. See, this I had never been taught. And I said, these guys have no response to this. Not one word. But this should be easy for them because we've had the same polemic against us, have we not? Remember Wellhausen? Remember the school in Tübingen in Germany? Remember the attacks against the person of Jesus Christ? The attacks against his death and resurrection? All the enormous attacks against Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the gospel, the letters of Paul, and the book of Revelation. They're huge attacks that were coming in the late 1800s until 1905. It decimated the church. That's called historical criticism. That's called form criticism, source criticism, textual criticism. Well, I've grown up with that, so we've already had this problem. And it decimated the church in Europe, and the church has never recovered. But otherwise, we've gone and found answers to every one of those criticisms. In fact, though we didn't start those criticisms in Christianity, we enlarged upon them, and we basically matured those criticisms so that today we can pretty well be able to answer every one of those. And that's exactly what they're going to be doing here at ELF these next few days. But this had never been applied to Islam. And I was watching as these guys were leaving. Well, I decided I was going to go down and take this material down to Speaker's Corner. Not a very smart thing to do. Speaker's Corner in the 1990s was very violent. And you say something they don't, if the Muslims don't like, they actually beat you up. You get punched in the face, you get your glasses broken. And I started getting my glasses broken. I started getting punched, and I'd come home with blood down my face. And one day I was trying to engage with some of these guys. What they would do is, at Speaker's Corner, whenever you want to speak, you get up on a ladder, these little kitchen ladders that you have in your kitchen, not very high, just 2 steps, just so your head's above the crowd. And you speak from there, but you have to create a crowd. And the way to create a crowd at Speaker's Corner is either be humorous or say something that's controversial, or get into a back and forth with the crowd itself. Those are the three areas that do that. And everyone in the afternoons, all the humanists had left, and all the Jehovah's Witnesses had left, and all of the black liberationists had left. Everybody had left because the Muslims showed up. And when the Muslims showed up, they didn't want to stay around because they don't yell at you, they actually beat you up. And that's why they're very physical. In the 1990s, I'm talking about the 1990s. And so I was in the middle of a crowd there, and there was a man, Sufyan is his name. Abu Sufyan, he was a convert to Islam. He used to be a professional boxer. And he had converted to Islam, and so now he had his own talibis. Talibis mean his own students all around him. He was from Trinidad. And he was taking on saying things about our Bible and saying things about Jesus Christ, and he was misquoting our scriptures. So I elbowed my way forward, and I started yelling at him. I said, "You've got it wrong, but why don't we talk about your material? What about your difficulties? What about your Qur'an? What about the internal errors that we have in the Quran?" He got off his ladder and he just slammed me. And now when you have a professional boxer hit you, you go out cold. I have no idea what happened next. All I know is the next, about a number of, well, however many minutes later, the police came and dragged me out, and I was battered and bruised. And I said to the police, "What happened?" And my lips were all gonfled, and they said, "They were kicking you. About 60 of the disciples were kicking you on the ground, and a big black man came and laid on top of you and took your blows for you." I said, "Well, where is he?" Just disappeared like that. So who do you think that was? That's Barry, my black angel. I have Barry that protects me every time I'm down there. Amazing guy. I've never really met him. I've only seen him twice, but the Muslims have seen him. So that happened in 1995, and the police came to me and said, "Don't you ever do what you just did today." I said, "Well, all I'm doing is asking questions." They said, "Don't you ever do that. You get your own ladder so we can see you at all times for my own protection." So I got a ladder, but they don't teach you in seminary how to speak from a ladder. Did you guys get taught like that when you were in seminary? To a hostile crowd? No, I remember in seminary we were taught homiletics, and you had 3 points, and everybody said yes to you, and you pretty much took those 3 points, applied it to Scripture, and then it showed how it is to be applied to your life. And if you did a good job, then you get a good handshake when you leave the church. Nothing like I had there at Speaker's Corner. And so at Speaker's Corner, it was very clear to me that this was a completely different atmosphere, and I was not ready for those kind of ladders. But what was fascinating is that this material that I was getting that was starting to be fed to me there at School of Oriental and African Study, this historical material, was probably the best thing to use on the ladder, because once you're on the ladder, you do have an awful lot of control. You have an awful lot of power. You can control the narrative on the ground, which you can't on the ground. More than that, you can be seen. Now, this is back in 1995. There was no internet back then. There was no smartphones back then. So we were not filming anything. We were just engaging the crowd that was there. And the crowds got larger and larger, and suddenly I realized I had to really use my voice. I was born and grew up in India, and I was born and grew up in the Himalaya mountains. So I was living at 7,000 feet. My boarding hostel was at about 6,500 feet. So I had to run up and down to school every day, 500 feet. And if I forgot something, I had to run back down and run back up again. So I've got huge lungs. I've got 5-liter lungs. For my body size, I should only have about 3.5. So I have 1.5 liters more. I can out-yell anybody. Because of that, the Lord has prepared me for Speaker's Corner. And so we started using this material, and I started using my lungs to get it out there. And the Muslims started making a ring about it and yelling at me. The great thing about Speaker's Corner, they're yelling my direction. I'm yelling over top of them to the crowd behind them. They've never really ever picked up on the fact that if they just turned around and yelled my direction, they could yell me out. But this way, we always got the message across. And I realized that this is a whole new area of polemics that no one had used before. Historical criticism. So we started doing these debates. You can see this guy over here. That's Muhammad Yusuf. He's actually is a convert to Islam. He's from America, and he speaks fluent Arabic. And he would come down there, and we would do these 5-minute debates. He would go for 5 minutes, I would go for 5 minutes. 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes. That's it. All you did 5 minutes, all you need is a timekeeper. And the crowds got enormous. We had huge crowds down there. The great thing about doing 5 minutes debates is that the Muslims could go for about 15 minutes and they give up. We could go for 3 hours. We have so much material that we're now using down there. I'm going to be there in about 2 weeks, back at Speaker's Corner. Every time I go through London, I get back up on the ladder, and we take on the Muslims with all our newest material. So in 1994, I should have put this up there. This is the Gerald Hatun. That's the professor that was teaching all this origins of Islam at School of Oriental and African Studies. SOAS is the school where they train up all of their foreign workers before they go out into the foreign field. This is where all your embassy people are trained during the British Raj and before that. So it is the center. When I say Oriental studies, they really mean Islamic or Middle Eastern studies, because when it was created, back then the Orient was the Middle East. Today the Orient now is Far East, but it's still called that. And that's where I was getting all my information. Now, about that time, I was challenged to a debate because it was obvious that the Muslims could not come up with any response to this historical material at all. So they asked if I would debate Dr. Jamal Badawi, who you see pictured there on the right. Dr. Badawi is the lead, at that time in the 1990s, was the world's leading authority on the Qur'an. He taught at Halifax University in Canada, but he went around the world and he did a series of 350 videos, these old VHS videos, that he, on the Quran, on how to understand it, how to unpack it, and how to exegete it. And so he was in Malaysia, was flying back to England on his way back to Halifax, and so his study base, his disciples asked, would I do a debate with him on the Qur'an? Because I was confronting the Quran historically. I was using and trying to come up with some type of manuscript details. I wanted to come up with how we could confront the Quran like the Bible had been confronted. So I said, well, listen, I've never debated before. I've never been taught how to do debate, but let's try it. Let's do it. Let's have a 2-hour debate. So he came through. We went to Cambridge University at Trinity College. And there in 1995, in August of 1995, we had the first debate that I've ever done on, is the Quran the Word of God? That was the title, Is the Quran the Word of God? He was thinking of only really showing how from internally the Quran is the Word of God. I was going to show from an external standpoint, there is no Quran. So that was the first time I'd ever used this material. And I gave 10 historical challenges. In order to get those challenges, I had gone to Cambridge University the week before, and I had gone into the office of a scholar named Dr. Patricia Corona. Does any of you know who she is? Dr. Patricia Corona? No one knows that name? Dr. Patricia Corona was at her time, before she died, was the world's leading scholar on ancient or archaic Islam. She reads and writes 15 languages, all archaic languages, many of which are no longer used today. She's from Denmark. She was head of department at Oxford University and wrote a book called Hagerism, was vilified for that, and then she went and wrote a book called Mecca Trade and the Rise of Islam in 1987, for which she got death threats for writing, basically doing what I'm going to do tomorrow. In fact, I wanted to use her material, so I wanted to get to know her, and I wanted to find it, and we went into her office, and for about 3 hours, she went through the material that I was going to go through, and she says, use that, no, don't use that, here's a better way to say it, here, let me give you some new material. And so after 3 hours, she gave me 10 historical challenges that I was going to give to Dr. Jamal Badawi. And I turned to her and I said, you know, Dr. Corona, why don't you do this debate? I've never done a debate in my life. I'm not a debater. Why don't you do this debate? This is your material. You know it intimately. You're the one that's researched it, and you've got such a lot of pizzazz. She's so passionate when she speaks. And she kind of looked at me and she laughed. She said, hold on a minute, Jay. Let me tell you something. I've got a chair to protect. I've got an institution to represent. Would never do this debate. In my department, there are many other Muslims. If I were to ever debate this material publicly, I would be thrown out of the university, even though I have tenure here. She says, but you have no chair to protect. And the only person you represent is Jesus Christ. Ooh, here was an atheist telling me who I represented. Isn't that amazing? It took an atheist to help me see what was happening here. She says, we in academia cannot debate this. And certainly not in Britain anymore. That's why I had to take my doctorate on and move it down to Australia, because you can't do a doctorate that's critical of Islam anymore in Britain. But I can, as a non-academic. Says, you're going to do this debate, and you're going to take on Jamal Badawi, and you're going to see that he won't be able to respond to any one of these 10 challenges. So I went down, we had the debate. He had never heard this material before, which is typical, because Muslims will never have heard what I'm going to tell you in the next 2 days. His only response was this: Mr. Smith, you're only arguing from silence. And the absence of evidence does not prove the evidence of absence. And he had hung me. You're right. The absence of evidence does not prove the evidence of absence. I couldn't really go beyond that. He had me. I had no comeback on that. He said, may not find it now, but give us time. We will find who Muhammad is. We will find where he lived. We will find all the material that we need to support him and what he said and what he did and where this place Mecca was, and of course the Kaaba itself. And as far as the Quran, don't try to take me on the Quran. I'm the world authority on this. Well, that was 1995, August 1995. We're now in May of 2024. What I'm going to share with you today and tomorrow completely turns the tables. Everything I'm going to show you does not come from the 9th or 10th or 11th or 12th century. Everything I'm going to share with you will come from the 7th and 8th century. I'm going to go to the very century where everything happened. I'm going to go to the very century where this man Muhammad lived, where supposedly where he received this Qur'an, and supposedly where he lived, but not only that, what he said and did. I'm going to shut all that down in the next 2 days. And the only thing I'm going to use is evidence. I'll be using coins. I'll be using inscriptions. I'll be using manuscripts. I will be using buildings. That's why it's very visual. That's why I want you to look at the screen as we go through it, all right? And that's why I want you to take this PowerPoint home with you so that you can use it wherever you're at. So that's all I'm going to do, and that's exactly what I've done. So what has happened in the intervening years, we've changed this whole discussion on its head. No longer am I arguing from silence. In fact, I have all the evidence. Everything he's going to say, now he's no longer living, so I can't debate him a second time, but everything that Muslims are going to say will be from silence. They will not be able to support either the man or their book or their place. And those are the three things we're going to hit. The book, the man, and the place. The book, the Quran, the man, Muhammad, and the place, Mecca. And so Colin Chapman, a good friend of mine, listen, I love Colin Chapman, but he decided that I had to stop this, stop going to Speaker's Corner, and stop using historical criticism. So he challenged me to a debate. He wasn't going to do the debate. Dr. David Marshall was going to do the debate. It was going to be an in-house debate at Sully Oaks College in Birmingham, and we were going to debate two things. The two things we were going to debate is, should we use polemics with Muslims, and should we employ historical criticism? Those are the two subjects, and I was saying yes to both, and Dr. David Marshall, who has his doctorate from Oxford University on the Quran, so he should know what he's talking about, he was going to argue that we should not do those. We should not use polemics, not against Muslims, and we should never use historical criticism because of the damage it has done to our Bible. And I'm scratching my head, what damage? So we went for 2 hours. Now, it was an in-house debate, which means only other Christians could come to it, but they had to be academics. They had to be people who were either doing their doctorate or they had a chair on a certain university. They had to be Christians, but they were all invited. And they only invited 50 scholars to come to this debate. 25 of them were academics who had chairs on different academic institutions around Britain. The other 25 were missionaries like me, who, though I had academic degrees, I didn't belong to any academic institution. We went for 2 hours, and then they have a show of hands. How many of you agree with Jay, and how many of you agree with David? How many of you think, or which group do you think went with me, and which group do you think went with David? The missionaries or the academics? Who do you think went with me? Well, let me give a show of hands. How many of you think the academics went with me? Put your hands up. Okay. How many of you thought the missionaries went with me? The missionaries have it. You're correct. But see, I didn't understand this at all. So Dr. Peter Riddell, on the way back to London, he was in the car with me. He was from Australia at the Melbourne School of Theology. He explained it to me. He said, Jay, I love what you're doing, and don't ever stop what you're doing, but don't ever ask me to do that. As academics, we cannot do this debate. We cannot even introduce this in our classes. We dare not go public with what you're saying. Because many times we have Muslims on staff with us. If ever a Muslim heard what we were saying, we would be thrown out of our universities. We could not. That's why all the academics went with David. It's out of necessity they had to go with him. But as far as I'm concerned, please don't ever stop. And that's why he became my supervisor for my PhD, because he had that attitude. And that's why I changed my doctorate from London School of Theology and moved it down to Melbourne School of Theology. So that happened in 1997. Now, since that time, I've come back to it, because then 9/11 happened. You all know what happened with 9/11, and that kind of changed the whole narrative. Suddenly, Islam, which was very much a religion of violence, now became a religion of peace almost overnight. And no longer were they beating us up at Speaker's Corner. It was so nice. I didn't get any bruised heads, or I didn't have any broken glasses. And it was so nice to be able to start finally discussing and using and talking and knowing that I'd get home on time every evening. So from 2001 up until 2017, when I was there, I started doing the debates for the different Christian unions around the university campuses. And I did about 100 I think, 100 formal debates on university campuses until 2010, when the Muslims realized that the material that we were using was just getting too strong, so they called me a hate preacher and an Islamophobe. Once you get that tag, no longer are you permitted on any university. So since 2010, I'm not permitted on any British university anymore. And others have to do it in my place. But what was fascinating is this material then started really coming into play in around 2020. So in the last 4 years, everything opened up. And it had to do with some coins that we found. Some coins that I'm going to introduce. In fact, I've got them in my bag. You're going to see the coins. And I'm going to encourage any one of you to buy these coins up. If you have any money, please buy them. You need them because the Muslims are buying them up and melting them down, because this is one of the most difficult evidences against them. I would ask you to also buy the rock inscriptions, but they're too big and they're not for sale, because the rock inscriptions are doing amazing, amazing work for us. But in 2020, I was in the British Museum, and Hatun Tash, who is my colleague. How many of you know who Hatun Tash is? Okay, have you met her? But you've seen her online, right? Well, she was my colleague for many years. She was studying under me at OCA, Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, back in 2012. And she thought I was arrogant, which I come across as, and so she decided that she wasn't going to listen to me. But I did say that every Sunday I go to a place called Speaker's Corner. It's only an hour away. And why don't you go, anybody come on down and let's get up on a ladder. And I'd love to try you guys out, or you gals out. And so she came down and never stopped coming. She fell in love with Speaker's Corner. One of the few in the world who can do what she does. And she has brought 1,000 Muslims to Jesus Christ in just 3 years, all on her own. All the Muslims are in Britain, and they're all around London. And she goes into mosque after mosque all by herself. No one invites her. She doesn't make any relationship. There's no friendship evangelism. She doesn't do a word of evangelism, that kind of evangelism. She just carries a bag, much like the one I have here, that black bag with the wheels on it, with 26 different Qur'ans. Yeah, that's right, 26 different Qur'ans. She's now up to 37. Every one of them are Arabic. They're all over 1,000 years old, not her copies, obviously. They all are from the 8th and 9th century, and no two are alike. Did you hear me? No two are alike. She's the first one to discover this. I found it. We're going to introduce that tomorrow when we get to the Quran. But she is an amazing woman because she gets beat up. She's had her ribs broken. She's had her feet broken. She's been hung, almost died. She's been knifed with a knife, stabbed with a knife. It's all on film. You can see it. And then finally they tried to kill her with a gun a year ago. This is in London. I'm not talking about Turkey, where she's from. This is in London. This has all happened. And she has now disappeared. We've lost track of her for the last 6 months. Well, I lie. We've just found out that she's alive and she's fine. She called me at about 3 weeks ago, so we now know she's okay. But pray for Hatun Tash. Hatun and I go back for many years, and she would get on the ladder with me, and she would be on one ladder, I would be here. And she only sleeps 3 nights a week. The other night, she's up all night studying. This 5'2" Turkish girl. And she I've been in, this is about 2, in fact, it was right after the ELF. The last time I was at ELF, I was here in ELF, and I had gone back to London, and whenever I go to London, she and I get back on the ladder again, and we go at it. Whatever is new, whatever we're covering, whatever we're studying, we field test. Speaker's Corner is the best laboratory in the world to field test your material, because you get peer-reviewed almost instantly. And you see what works, what doesn't work. And there's no other place on earth you can do that, because it's the only place where there are no guns. I mean that. In America, for those of you who are American, I can't do this. We tried it at Washington Square, people got killed. We tried it at Santa Monica, people got killed. People who get upset in America pull out their guns and shoot you. You don't have guns in England, so you can get away with this. At the most, they could just beat you up, which is fine. At least you survive. And so I was down there in 2019 after ELF, and she says, Jay, there's a real problem, because in the British Museum, they have the coins, they have these Islamic coins there, and they have the Shahada with La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. They are attributing it to Muawiyah, but you've told me that this has nothing to do with Muawiyah. I said, that's interesting. This is a gold solid disc, and there it was in the British Museum, attributing it to Muawiyah when this is something that was introduced by Abdul Malik 30 years later. So they had misappropriated the date, which, a museum can do. She says, could you go back to the States and hunt it up and make sure that I'm correct? And I said, you are correct. I don't even have to hunt it up. So I went back and I decided, both Hatun and I do YouTube. We do YouTube videos. I've been doing YouTube videos since 2006. YouTube only was invented in 2005, so I've been doing almost as long as YouTube is going. So for 17 years, we put videos up, always polemics, using and whatever is the newest material. So I started putting these videos up in 2020, right before COVID hit. And I started asking these questions, and I said, listen, if the British Museum can get this wrong, how are the rest of us? What's going to happen to the rest of us? You've got to get your dates right. You've got to be able to follow the coins. And you've got to use the coins and then find out what they're saying. Well, I didn't know this because I was not a numismatist, and I'm not very much into coins, but suddenly I started getting, the great thing about YouTube is you have all the comments at the bottom, and you can just read the comments. And as I was reading the comments, I noticed that these numismatists, who are experts, were responding. It says, you're right, they're correct. You got it correct, but we don't understand what's happening because these coins make no sense. And I said, what do you mean they don't make any sense? He said, well, read the Arabic. I said, you can read it better than I can. What are the problems? Tell me what's going on. And they said, it doesn't fit the standard Islamic, it doesn't fit the Islamic traditions. It doesn't, I said. Well, then just read to me what they are. So this is in 2020. We started putting these coins up, coin after coin. And a guy named Odin Lafontaine from France was the one that I started really engaging with. He'd been working on this for 25 years. And he is the one that has really helped me the most. Now, I've never met him. We've only been online to each other, and we've only been on YouTube together. In 2 weeks, I'm going to meet him for the first time in London. And we're bringing all the best polemicists in the world to London in 2 weeks. You're not to tell the Muslims that, all right? Because we're all going to be in one venue for 3 days. David Wood's going to be there. Anthony Rogers is going to be there. I'm going to be there. Al-Fadi is going to be there. All the biggest names in Islamic polemics we're going to get together. Odin Lafontaine's going to be there. Mel's going to be there from Ireland, and Dr. Robert Kerr from Germany. So we're bringing lots of the best minds together, and we're just going to start hammering out the 3 different forms of polemics, and then we're all going to go to Speaker's Corner on the 9th of June and take down the Muslims and film everything, so you'll see everything that happens. So here she was going with these coins, and I started realizing that I've got to shift gears and start just really engaging with this historical material. So that started in 2020. Then, of course, COVID hit. And when COVID hit, everybody was at home watching our videos. And so our videos suddenly just skyrocketed as far as the number of people watching. And what we noticed is that there were 4 areas that we were trying to get at. The 4 areas that we're going to do this 2 days are, first of all, the problem of sources. This is the thing that we noticed that many people had not heard about or didn't understand. The difficulty of sources. Then we went and we started looking at Mecca. And Mecca is fascinating because, as you're going to find out, it's the one place that does exist today and still exists today that we can therefore research because it is still there. And then, of course, Muhammad himself. The problem with Muhammad is it is difficult to engage about Muhammad because Muslims have a visceral attachment to Muhammad. You can confront the Qur'an, they're not going to say too much. You can confront Allah, they're not going to say too much. Once you confront Muhammad, it's like turning on a switch on inside and they just go visceral. They get emotive. So you have to be very careful when you confront Muhammad. So I'm going to be very careful when we get to this period, but you're going to notice I'm not going to confront Muhammad. I'm not going to say dilly swat about Muhammad. I don't care dilly swat about him because I don't even think he existed. But I have to prove that. And then we found out that the best material to use is this. So in our 2 days, I'm going to save it to last. By far, the best and the easiest material to use is confronting the Qur'an. So these are the 4 areas we're going to investigate. And we're going to start then with the problem of sources. If the sources are wrong, everything gets crashing down. Oops, I forgot. I do need to introduce the people whose research I'm using. These are the people who have gone ahead of me. These are the people who actually have the work that we're doing, on whose shoulders we stand. Now, the revisionist, by definition, means the theory of or practice of revising one's attitude to a previously accepted situation or point of view. Those who've gone ahead are the revisionists who have actually found that there's a problem with the existing structure, and therefore you revise it depending on what history tells you. So they question the standard Islamic narrative. We call it the standard Islamic narrative because of a certain cleric named Dr. Yasar Qadi, who actually introduced that in 2020 when he was doing an interview, and I'll talk more about that tomorrow. And he was the one that admitted that the standard narrative has holes in it. The standard Islamic narrative has holes in it. So we jumped on it, and I took it, and we said, that's great. Let's just talk about the standard Islamic narrative, S-I-N. We all know that sin has holes in it. So what we're going to do is take, and we're going to shut down those standard Islamic narrative. But we have to look and see of those who've gone ahead. So who are they exactly? Well, probably the ones who have been the foremost, the ones who started the whole ball going, are the Germans. And you need to start with Dr. David Heinrich Müller. He was an Austrian Orientalist. He was a Semitist and a linguist and a literary theorist. And he was the one that conjectured that there was a hidden verse structure in the Quran that suggests, therefore, it has been borrowed. Dr. Ignaz Goldziher suggested that the Hadith, that's the sayings of Muhammad, reflected legal and doctrinal controversies of 2 centuries after the death of Muhammad, not during the time of Muhammad. He believed strongly that the Islamic law owes its origins to Roman law, but in the opinion of Patricia Corone, his arguments here were uncharacteristically weak. And then, of course, Dr. Theodor Nolldecke, who probably you all know, he was the noted German historian and linguist who read and translated Arabic, Persian, and Syriac literature, and that's why he's done us such a great favor. He is the one that translated Al-Tabari's Tariq, which would be the Tariq would be the histories of all mankind. Started in German and now it's been into English. Dr. Adolf von Harnack, Baltic German Lutheran theologian, prominent church historian, he was the one that actually was the first to suggest that maybe much of the structure of the Quran came out of Judeo-Christian documents. But he was doing that way back in the last century, way before anybody else had suggested that. Christian Schnick, I don't know how to pronounce that last name. If anybody knows your German, could you pronounce it for me? Is it Hurgönje? I have no idea because I'm desecrating whatever I'm going to do. He's a Dutch Orientalist, Arabist, and Semitist, one of the founders of the modern Islamic studies, and has done an amazing job on the linguistic side of things. And then, of course, Alphonse Mingana, who is the one that has been a Syriac scholar. His collection is there in Birmingham, and of course, it was his collection where the Birmingham folios were found. But he was the one that speculated that the Quran contained Aramaic words and phrases, but didn't go any further than that. If he'd only gone a little bit further and scratched a little bit deeper, he would have probably come to the same conclusions that Dr. Luxemburg came to. Other ones like Arthur Jeffrey out of Australia. Now, he is the one that has probably done the best work on looking at and unpacking the Hadith and showing what the Hadith say about how the Quran was put together. He is the one that's found the foreign words, that many of them borrowed from other sources, and he is the one that has been able to find that there were 15,000 differences just between the 4 metropolitan codices of Zayd ibn Thabit and Abu ibn Ka'b, and also Ibn Masud and Ibn Musa. Joseph Schacht came a little bit later, and he was a German scholar that confronted the Islamic laws, the 4 schools of Islamic law, and showed that almost all of them were written much, much too late to be authoritative. And then my good friend Gunther Lulling, who I know personally, German theologian, no longer living, but we're going to talk more about Gunther Lulling tomorrow, so I won't say too much more about him because he's done an amazing job. More recently, the ones here in Britain, like Dr. John Wansborough, who's actually an American, but he started the whole revisionist group camp in Britain at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And he is the one that was the first to go back and look and see where the linguistic analysis, by unpacking the linguistic parts of the Quran, he was able to show that much of these did not exist at the time of Muhammad. They could only have been introduced at a later date, in fact, 100 to 200 years later. And his 2 books on that, Quranic Studies and Sectarian and Milieu, are probably some of the most foundational works on just that he wrote in 1977. Because he wrote those 2 books, he got a death threat and had to leave London, move to Paris, and stop doing any Islamic work because of the death threat. Dr. Yehuda Nevo, who is a Middle Eastern archaeologist, his book, Crossroads to Islam, get it if you don't have it, The Origins of the Arab Religion in the Arab State. He's been really good on looking at the earliest inscriptions and unpacking the inscriptions for us so that we can understand them, so we can know where they're going and what they're saying. Dr. Norman Calder, I don't know as well. He's a British historian linguist. He did an awful lot of work on looking on Islamic law along like what Eric Schacht was doing about a century earlier. And then, of course, my favorite scholar is Dr. Patricia Corone. She actually was my second supervisor for a while on my doctorate. And I got to know her well, and I've never seen a more tenacious woman nor a more brilliant person than her. Her mind was just enormously able, and she was able to write so many books. basically has pushed the envelope back on mostly on the origins argument, this argument that we're talking about. Her book on Hagerism has been vilified, unfortunately, because she made a mistake there, and she admits that she did. But because of that, they've just basically thrown the whole book out the window without looking at the footnotes. But Meccan Trade, if you're going to buy one book or get one book, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, if you don't have it, I have it in PDF. You can get it from me before you leave. In fact, I have a lot of these books in PDF. You can have them because they're no longer in print, so we're allowed to give them away. Dr. Andrew Rippon was probably the best one who actually went back to the historical critique, looking at the formative years from the 7th and 8th century, and then put it together in a layman's terminology so we can understand it. So if you have a chance, Muslims, the religious beliefs and practices, though it was written in 1990, it's still relevant for today. And then my professor, Dr. Gerald Hatun, has done a great job of looking at the first century of Islam and showing from a historical standpoint there's an enormous amount of problems with it. Dr. Robert Hoyland is the first one to actually take all the extra Quranic material, extra Islamic material, all the writings that are happening in the 7th and 8th century and distilling them down into one place to show you what the world outside of Islam was saying about these supposed Muslims. So his book on Seeing Islam as Other Side has become a classic. Be careful. Be careful. He does translate it because he reads and writes 18 languages. The problem is he doesn't translate them as they are. So whenever you see Muhammad, whenever you see the word mim ha mim dal, he pronounces it Muhammad, when it doesn't say that at all. How could you have mim ha mim dal saying Muhammad when there was no vowels in the 7th century to make that distinction? So he does make mistakes every once in a while, but that's a lot of it may be to political pressure. And Dr. Stephen Shoemaker, I don't know, I can't say enough about this guy. This guy is the first one to have taken everything that the scholars have been saying and put it into one volume. And so his book that just came out 2 years ago, Creating the Quran, a historical critical study, Dr. Al-Fadi and myself unpacked, we did a 62 video series just on his book. But get that book. It is a mine of information. And everything he does, he quotes other scholars. But he does a huge job for us by putting it into one tome. He's from Oregon University in the United States. The German revisionist scholars mostly of the Quran in its beginning. And so these are the ones who are in Germany, and they're all part of the Inada group. That's Volker Popp, who has done the best work on the coins for us. Dr. Marco Gross, who looks at the emergence of Islam. Dr. Robert Kerr, a very good friend of mine. In fact, he's coming to our conference in 2 weeks, and I'm doing a keynote speak on just all these scholars. Dr. Karl-Heinz Ohlig, he's done an amazing work on the Sana manuscript, along with Dr. Gerd Puyn. And I should really have his wife up there, Dr. Elizabeth Puyn, they're all out of Saarland University in Saarbrücken in Western Germany. And they're the only ones that can read the original manuscripts because there's no dots or vowels in them. No Arab can read them, but they can read them. And so that's why they're such a treasure trove for us. Same with Dr. Johannes Thomas. Dr. Genevieve Gobilo is actually from France, though she does most of her work in Germany now, and Dr. Masen Grodzki on Arab and Aramaism. Dr. Christoph Luxemburg, though that's not his real name, he's the Aramaic scholar in this whole group, and he is actually Lebanese, though he does all his work in German. So these are the German revisionists, and every one of them have cherished in universities. They have to be careful what they say, and so much of what they do, they're not making public. But they're giving us and they're feeding us the material so we can go public with it. Isn't it great? So lots of the stuff that I'll be introducing in the next days really come from these guys and these gals. They're not going to say what I'm going to say, but they did the research. They have the languages. They are the ones that have the manuscripts. They are the ones that are reading them. They are the ones that are coming to conclusion. Our job then is to communicate it so the whole world can see it. All right, do you see the difference? We're missionaries. Yes, I'm an academic, but I'm an academic in a Christian institution, thank God, Veritas International University, the Calvary Chapel Seminary. So these are the ones that are doing the groundwork for us right now, and they're amazing minds, every one of them. I'll be getting into the Syro-Aramaic, and then Ibn Malik has probably done one of the best job of taking and disseminating this very difficult material and putting it into layman's terminology so the rest of us can read it. And he's from the Indian subcontinent. Robert Spencer and I go back many years, and we've worked an awful lot together. Robert Spencer is another populist who takes material that's hard for people to understand and popularizes it so that everybody can understand. But he cannot leave the United States. He can't come to Britain. He can't come here. No country will allow him in because he's been so explosive in his books. He has so many books on that. In fact, Did Muhammad Exist is his book. He was the first to actually publish that. Did Muhammad Exist in 2012. We were working together online, and I looked at it, I said, you know, Robert, you're about 2 years behind. You've not kept up with, I'm sorry, not 2 years, you're 12 years behind. This is back in 2020. I said, why don't you go and run down what the coins are saying? Why isn't you going and keep up with the newest material on the Qur'an? He says, well, where is it? I said, well, we've got it. Why don't you use it? So I asked him to rewrite it. So he rewrote it again in 2021 and sent me the PDF of the copy before, just that he had just sent to the publisher. And I read it, and I got on the phone to him. I said, Robert, you're still about 6 months behind. He said, well, I've already given it to the publisher. So he said, would you put her forward? So I wrote the foreword for him in his book, just to explain that this is the problem. Even what I'm going to tell you in the next 2 days, in 1 year, I'm going to tell you something different. It's not going to contradict it, but it's going to embellish it. We're just moving ahead. In fact, I'm going to tell you 2 things in the next 2 days that we've only learned in the last 2 months. That's how exciting this is. It just gets better and better and better. But the problem is, once you publish it, what happens? You've got to republish it. So I'm going to ask him now to redo another copy for 2025, then 2027. So I'm suggesting every 2 years, just send out a new copy with all the newest discoveries. We have so many new discoveries. I have 7 men who are doing the research for me now. I can't give you all their names. I'm not permitted to. But they're the ones who actually know the languages. They're the ones who are actually doing the hard material. My job is just to communicate it to the rest of the world. And that's your job as well, to communicate what we now know. But we have to give credit to these guys and gals who are doing that. Peter Townsend, I've never met him before. I like what he's doing. I don't agree with everything he said about Mecca. He's from Australia, and I'd love to get to know him and can take him out for dinner. And then the new revisionists, these are the ones who are working with me, particularly Dr. Bernie Powers out of Melbourne School of Theology. He does an awful lot of debates. He is the one who's done an awful lot of work on the Qira'at. You don't know what I'm talking about. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. Dr. Dan Brubaker is a real good friend of mine. We've been together for about maybe 15 years, and he is the one that probably has done more damage to the Quran just by looking at the variants, the manuscript variants that we're going to talk about tomorrow. And he's found over 4,000 of these manuscript variants. That's a terrible picture of it. Why did they put that one up there? I'll have to change that. And then there's Hatun Tash, my colleague, who has done an amazing job on the Qira'ats and the Ahruf. We'll talk more about her tomorrow. Pat Andrews, I can't show you his pictures. I'm not permitted to, and that's not his name. But of all the research, he does by far the most research for me. This man has an eidetic memory. That means anything he reads, he memorizes. He knows even the page number. He has pictures of everything he reads. He knows where the paragraphs come. You just cannot debate this guy. He has every word. He knows all the dates. The guy is prodigious, and boy, I'm so glad he's on our side. So that's Dr. Pat Andrews. We're going to be together in 2 weeks as well in London. And then Mel, good old Mel Cormorcan. Mel is such an enjoyment because he is a Catholic. He's a Catholic, a Catholic brother of mine who just cannot stop producing new material, finding everything and trying to put it all together. So I've been bringing him on board with the word Muhammad in the last 2-3 weeks. And he'll be with us in London as well. Murad is I'm not permitted to tell you where he's from. I can't even tell you what background he is, but he is an Arabic and a Syriac scholar, and I'm not permitted to show you his picture. Dan Gibson is a Canadian who's done a lot of work on the Qibla. We're not going to do too much on the Qibla tomorrow. We're just going to introduce it and show you what we now know about the direction of prayer for all the mosques. But he's by far been way ahead of the rest of the game because he's the only one that has actually gone to the mosques, every mosque personally, and looked at them. If you're going to be an expert on the Qiblas, you should go to the mosque, don't you think? You should actually physically go there. Well, he's the first to do so, and it took him 25 years to do so. Odon Lafontaine, the smoking priest from Paris, he's a Catholic priest who has been working for 25 years on the coins. We're going to be together in London in 2 weeks, and so it's just going to be actually 2 weeks. It's actually next week, so not 2 weeks. Thomas Alexander is out of Germany, and he has been part of the Inada group, and has been really exciting to have him. Though he's not an expert in this area, what he does is he disseminates it, and he has a clinical mind, like many Germans have, and is able to introduce it to us in English. And then Paul Ellis is the one that has done by far the best work. He's out of London. He does the best work on what we call the Jerusalem paradigm. He'll be with us in 2 weeks as well. Joe, the Red Judaism, I misspelled that. I should say Judaism. Red Judaism. He is from Israel. and he is a Jew, you can tell by his name, has a clinical mind, has been really helpful on understanding what's happening between the 7th and 8th century, coming out of Jewish sources. And then Al-Fadi is one of my best friends. Al-Fadi is a Saudi Arabian. He is who used to be a Salafi, wanted to join Al-Qaeda. He now fell in love with Jesus, has left Saudi Arabia, is finishing up his doctorate on the Sana manuscript, is already the world's leading authority on the Sana manuscript. And he and I do an awful lot of episodes together in his studio. And then Sarah Lumgear, I was hoping she'd come to this conference so you can meet her personally. She has done by far the best work on Islamic slavery and has way ahead of the games on. Boy, she has come up with some enormous historical material. So here's the question. Why the historical critique of Islam's origin? Why in the world are we doing this? What's the purpose of it? When I did this talk at Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills in September, because it was so short and Jack Hibbs realized it was too short and too fast, he called me up and he says, listen, I understand you're in Africa at the moment, but when you come back, could you come back in November and could you now do it again, but this time in 4 hours, not 1 hour? Well, when Jack Hibbs asks you to do something, you usually jump. So I said, okay, in fact, I would love to do it in 4 hours. So I went back in November, and after a 4-hour lecture, I said, I only want people to come who really want to come. So I want them to sign up. I want them to register. I don't want people just walking off the street. I want people who were there in September to return if they really want to know the material. So he said, yes, we'll be in a room like this. And so they put it out, the word out, and 1,000 people signed up. Well, you can't get 1,000 people into a room this size, so we had to open up the sanctuary. So we opened up the sanctuary, and that gave me the big screens, so I could just point to the big screens. At the end of 4 hours, I went and I asked the same question I'm going to ask you tomorrow. And I asked them, how many of you who were there, how many of you understood 100% of what I just said? And about 900 of them raised their hands. So 90% raised their hands. So I asked them, how is it you could understand, since you only heard it once, and now you're hearing it a second time, how is it you understood what I was saying? And they said, well, the first thing is it doesn't confront it confronts the very foundations of Islam, the Book of the Man, but it is so easy because it's so visual. As you're going to see, everything I'm going to show you, I'm going to be showing you maps, I'm going to be showing you timelines, I'm going to be showing you manuscripts, I'm going to be showing you coins, and I'm going to show you all these things. Everything I'm going to show you is visual. Thirdly, it's neutral. Anybody can use it. You don't have to be a Christian to use it. You don't have to be anybody can use it. It's also very politically correct because you're not attacking Muhammad, nor are you attacking the Quran, nor are you attacking Muslims. Therefore, it's not hate speech. It is not Islamophobic, and that is true. Since 2020, when I've been engaging only in the historical critique, I have not had one strike on YouTube. I would get strikes all the time, but not any longer. And the reason why is I'm not attacking Muhammad. I'm not attacking Muslims. I'm not talking about Muhammad's misogyny or his violence. I don't need to. What a waste of time. I'm asking a much deeper question. Did he exist? That's much deeper and much more difficult to answer. But not hate speech, that's all. And of course, this one made me laugh. The greatest thing they thought about it is they didn't have to know a word of Arabic. Everything I'm going to show you, you don't have to know a word of Arabic. I'm going to show you some Arabic words, but I'm going to show you what to look at. I'm going to show you what dot to look like, whether it's there or not there, whether it's above the word or below the word. It's going to be as visual. You don't even have to know the word you're looking at, but I'm going to translate it for you. You can see how it changes depending on where the dot is. That's about as far as I'm going to go with the Arabic, okay? That's what really makes Americans happy. They do not like Arabic. Well, not just Americans. I found out, I was just in Prague last night, 2 nights ago, and in Prague, they didn't like the Arabic either, so they loved the fact that they didn't have to know any Arabic. And the best thing, and this is what they all said, the best thing is, though everything we're going to talk about in the next 2 days shuts down the book, shuts down the man, and shuts down the place, we're the only ones that have a better book, a better man, and a better place to bring him home to. That's the beauty of this. Like with like, if you were going to, and I'm going to do that, I'm going to do like with like, and I'm going to show how much better our manuscripts are, how much better are not only the manuscripts, but also the historical evidence that we have, and how much better our place is. So, why are we doing this? Well, you know the Robert Frost. I'm not going to go through the whole poem, but if you've heard the poem, he goes into the woods and he sees two paths. One path going off to the right and another path going off to the left. He's come to a fork. He wants to know which way he should go. Now this one going off to the right, it was well trodden. There were no weeds. You can tell it had been very heavily used. But this one off here, it was full of weeds. No one had gone this way. So he had to make a decision. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. We're going to go down stuff you've never heard before. This is the first time you're going to hear it from most of you. Some of you may have heard bits and pieces of it. Some of you won't have heard everything of it. But we're going to go down the less traveled world. We're not going to go down the standard Islamic narrative. We're going to go right against it. We're going to ask the historical questions. This is called the external polemics. Three forms of polemics that we use. Internally, that's looking at the Quran as it is and confronting it from within, looking at the contradictions, looking at all the misogyny, looking at all the irrelevancy of the Quran itself. That's called internal polemics. Then you have the cultural polemics, looking at Islam as it is today and seeing how irrelevant it is or the problems it has with all of its different structures. And then you have the external polemics, and that's what I do. External polemics is throwing away the Quran, not even looking at the Quran, not even looking at Muhammad, asking a much deeper question, did these books even exist? By doing that, you're looking at what history says. That's the external critique, and that's the road we're going to go down. We chose the road less traveled by, and in time, you will see why. So the claims that the standard Islamic narrative gives. The standard Islamic narrative means the Islamic traditions for radicals or nominals. Every Muslim will make these claims, whether they are over here on the right, the radicals, or the nominals in the middle, or the liberals on the left. Now let me define what I mean by that. A radical Muslim is just like a radical number. A radical number means a root number. So you go back to the root. So a radical Muslim will go back to the Quran and go back to Muhammad. A radical Muslim was defined by Ibn Taymiyyah in the 1300s to be a good Muslim. Read the Quran, follow Muhammad. Read the book, follow the man. Read the book, follow the man. So a radical Muslim reads the book, understands it in Arabic, and then applies it in his own life. Read the book, follow the man. Many people have said, when is Islam going to have its Reformation? Well, stop and think. 200 years later, another man, a German this time, Martin Luther, said much the same thing, did he not? To be a good Christian, read the book, sola scriptura, and follow Jesus Christ. Read the book and follow the man. Read the book and follow the man. The book of the man. We call that our Reformation, and I'm telling Muslims they had their Reformation 200 years before us. So a radical Muslim on the right, they will follow the book. They will read the book, and that's why I like to engage with them much better, because they are the ones who understand the book, and I know exactly I have something in common with them. Nominals in the middle are those who usually come to the West, they come to America, they come to Britain, they come to Europe, and they come basically for a better life. They want to have a job. They want to have an education. Many of them come here with that intent. Most of them have never read the book. They have never opened the Quran. They have maybe memorized a few chapters, but they only know about the only thing they know would be the 5 pillars. That's about it. The 5 practices. That's about it. Don't ask them to understand the book because they have never read it. The radicals have, but not the nominals. The liberals over here on the left, those are the guys and gals who have read the book and have rejected it. And they are the ones who are now in our universities. You see them all over Britain. You see them in London. And they are the ones who are on our television shows. And they are the ones who are being basically used by the media because they are the ones who are sanitizing Islam and making it palatable for the European mind. So I don't waste much time with these because these are a very small group. The biggest group are in the middle. When you had 9/11 in 2001, they did a survey in 2002, a year later, and they wanted to try and find out how many people supported, this is in 2001, this is in October, the month later. They wanted to find out how many people supported Al-Qaeda, who would be a radical group here because they followed the book exactly. Everything they do, everything ISIS did, you can follow it you can find it. Everything they did, you can find it in the Quran. I can give you verse after verse right now what they did. So they wanted to find out how many Muslims in Britain followed this group over here. It was about 15%. 15%. They wanted to find out how many were in this group right here. These are the nominal ones who are greengrocers. They're the ones that you meet. They're the ones who are in school with you. They're the ones that probably many of you have friends with. They're in this group. They really didn't know the Quran. They call themselves Muslims. They go to the festivals, and they may go to the mosque maybe once in a month, but they are not really that religious. And that was about 70% of all Muslims in Britain. And the last were 15% over here, who had already given up Islam, wanted nothing new, and that's why they were in Britain, to get away from Islam. A year later, they wanted to do another survey to find out if anything had changed. And this group over here, which had only been 15%, had grown to 25%. in just 1 year, taking from this middle group, still 15% over here. Now this one was not 70, but 60%. In 2006, they did a third survey, and this was done by Q News and also the Guardian newspaper, and they found that this group over here that had been first 15, then had been a 25%, had now grown to 43%. Almost half of all Muslims had moved to the radical group within just 5 years. And when asked, why is it, what moved them, what changed them, was they started reading the standard Islamic narrative. They started going back to the Islamic tradition. They started going back to find out why these men and these women were flying those planes into that building. Why is it that this group that called Al-Qaeda, which means the foundation, why is it they were doing what they were doing? And they found it was in the Quran itself. The more they read the book, the more they came across these verses. Slay the unbeliever wherever you find them. That's in chapter 9, verse 5. Make war on the people of the book until they pay the jizya tax. That's chapter 9, verse 29. Cut off the heads of the unbeliever. That's in chapter 47, verse 4. Cut off the hands of the thieves. That's chapter 5, verse 38. I could go on and on. There's 150 of these verses in the Quran. But they had never read the Quran before. Not in English, not in Urdu or Punjabi. This was the first time they had read it. And now they were coming across and realizing this is eternal. This is an eternal book. This is a book that must be obeyed. Not understood, but obeyed. So they're moving off more and more to the right. And then they had to go back to the traditions to find out how their walk, talk, eat, and drink. Because you can't find much in the Quran about how to walk, talk, eat, and drink. You have to go to the traditions, the Islamic traditions. So this is what they say. The traditions make this claim. Muhammad, they say, was the last and greatest prophet who was born in Mecca in 570 and died in Medina in 632. He is the one that modeled Islam as the paradigm for the world, and he is the one that received the Quran as the final revelation for the world. The Quran, his revelation, was sent down only to him between that 22-year period, 610 to 632. It is the greatest, the only perfectly preserved, and the final revelation. And it is the one that corrects all previous revelations. Therefore, Islam is the final religion based on Muhammad's life and saying, the Sunnah, and on the Quran's teaching. So there you have the man, the book, and of course, the religion itself. Conclusion, thus Islam is completely dependent on these two things, the Quran and Muhammad, and I'm added a third one, the place as well. You'll see why. So the book, the man, and the place. Or, since these three areas are foundational to Islam, it is impingent on us to therefore investigate them. But we need to investigate them at the time they all existed, in other words, the 7th century, and in the place they all existed, the Hijaz. The Hijaz is that central part of Arabia where Mecca and Medina are situated. So it's over in the western part of Arabia, central western Arabia. So let's start by looking at the problem of sources and then move to Mecca. So look at the sources. Where do their sources come from? To do that, let's look at a map. When you look at a map, you will see that this part here, and let's just put up Muhammad himself. When Muhammad died in 632, it was this brown part right here that was under their control, okay? Not very big at all. So there's Mecca and Medina. That's in the Hijaz, and that's known as the Hijaz area. When he died in 632, then Abu Bakr came to power. He only lasted 2 years. Then Umar came to power. He lasted 10 years. He went from 632 to 634 to 644. He was killed, and then Uthman came to power, and from 644 to 656, he lasted only 12 years, and then he was killed, and then Ali finally took over, and he only lasted 5 before he was killed, and that's known as the Rashidun period, which includes the 4 rightly guided caliphs. That includes Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, those 4. So roughly 40 years that they then ruled, and that's the orange area. So the borders moved out from that brown area into the orange area, and they include all the way from Afghanistan in the east, all the way to Tripoli in the north, from Turkey in the north, in the west, Turkey in the north, all the way down to Yemen in the south. Look at that map, memorize that map, because I'm not interested so much in the purple area, because that's then the Umayyads. When the Umayyads came in 651, they then broadened the borders of Islam to include Andalusia, which is now Spain today, in the west, all the way to Kabul, Afghanistan in the east, and Turkey in the north, down to Yemen in the south. So that's the area of the Umayyad dynasty. However, forget about the purple area. Let's just deal with the brown and the orange area, those 2 areas, okay? Can you memorize that? Get that in your head? I may have to come back to it so that just to remind you of it. So according to what the Islam tells us, this is the timeline of their emergence. This is their story. This is not my story. This is what they tell us. Muhammad was born in 570. The Quran was revealed in 610, there in the Hira cave when he was suddenly woken up. He was doing his meditation, and there was the angel Jibril who told him, Akra, his means read, and his response was, Ma'akra, I cannot read. He could not read or write, and so he was squeezed. And this happened 3 times. All 3 times he says, Ma'akra, I cannot read. And so finally the angel let him go. He went back to Mecca, and he told his wife Khadija. He only had one wife at that time. She was older than him, and she controlled him. She was in charge of all the trade. And so she had a test. She had him sit on one knee and asked him, was that an angel that was talking to you? And he said, yes, it was. So then she had him sit on the other leg and asked the same question. He had the same response. And then she took off all her clothes, was naked, knowing the angel would not be there to whisper in his ear. She knew that if he answered yes again, that he was telling the truth. That was her test. And then she went to her cousin named Waraka ibn Nawfal, who was a Nestorian Christian. Isn't that interesting? A Nestorian Christian, and she asked him, truly, what he has told me, what is going on? And he said, this is a prophet. So it was a Nestorian Christian that announced that Muhammad was a prophet, according to their story, and that happened in 610. In 621, he was woken up in the middle of the night by Jibril and told to get on the back of a winged horse called the Burak, and he flies up from Mecca all the way to Jerusalem, where the Dome of the Rock sits today. That rock that's there, he then ascended the 7 heavens and met Allah. And when he was talking to Allah, Allah said that you're to pray 50 times a day. So he decided to go back down. He came to the 5th heaven, and he bumped into Moses. Moses, what did he tell you? And he said, well, I'm to pray 50 times a day. Moses, wait, that's way too many. Go back and see if you can get it down. So he bounces back and forth between the 7th and the 5th heaven, getting it from 50 down to 45, down to 30, down to 15, down to 10, down to 5 prayers. Once he gets it down to 5 prayers, he sees Moses and he says, that's enough, head on back down to earth. So the 5 prayers that Muslims do today is all because of Moses. And that happens in 621, known as the Miraj. Once he gets down to Jerusalem, gets back on the winged horse, he flies back on down to Mecca. So that happens in 621 in his life. 622 the very next year, because of all the persecution he was getting from his revelations there in Mecca. He then moved from Mecca up to Medina, called the Hijrah, the Exodus, with about 80 to 200 of his followers. And that began what we know as the beginning of the Islamic calendar and the beginning of the Caliphate. However, some dispute that and say it happened in 624. We know that in 630, he then walked back to Mecca and took it over without firing a shot. And then 2 years later, he then dies, poisoned by one of his wife, his Jewish wife. Now, have any of you heard any other story? I've just given you bare skeleton, all right? Just to give you the major things in Muhammad's life. Have you heard a different story than this? No, you haven't. This is the only story you've heard, right? Because this is the only story you're going to hear, because this is the one that was written by Ibn Hisham that all of you read today. Any school, anywhere, only has one narrative. And this is it, what you're looking at. We know that Abu Bakr lasted about 2 years. He was the one that had the first Quran compiled, the first recension of the Quran compiled between 632 and 634. He died peacefully, but the man that followed him only lasted 10 years, and he was one that expanded the borders and went all the way from Tripoli over this side, all the way to almost Afghanistan on this side, and from Turkey up in the north to Yemen and Oman in the south. So that's the man who did the most of the expansion of the caliphate. He was then replaced after he was killed by Uthman. And Uthman is interesting because Uthman is the one that actually revised the Quran and gave us the Quran that we have in our hands today. So this Quran that you have here, so this is the Uthmanic recension. I've got a copy of it. And you're probably curious as to what's the other one then. We'll get to that tomorrow. That was compiled in 652. Not that one, of course. That's a new copy. But 652. So that's mid-7th century. He then is killed in 656, and then Ali takes over, and he only lasts for 5 years before he is killed at the Battle of Siffin by Muawiyah in Siffin itself. So that is basically the emergence of Islam. That's the story you're told. That's the story we've all been told. That's the story no one's ever really has ever balked at. Conclusion, Islam was fully formed in the Hijaz by 661, within 40 years. Question, how do we know all of the above? Where does it come from? Well, let me ask you this. Where would you like the story to have come from? Muhammad, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. You would like to have come from people that knew these guys, right? Like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Did not Matthew and John know Jesus? They wrote what they saw. Didn't they not write what they heard? So we would like to have eyewitness accounts for what Muhammad saw, what Muhammad did, and what Muhammad said, right? Wouldn't we want the same thing that we have for Christianity? Of course we would. So hopefully that these are all written down by eyewitnesses, or at least got it from the eyewitnesses, like Luke and Mark got it from their eyewitnesses, and Paul later on. You would like to think that, right? Or at least someone who lived in that area, am I correct? And lived in that century. Okay, so 30 years, 40 years, maybe 100 years of oral tradition, we're willing to go with that. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. You'd be happy, wouldn't you, if I were able to say that? I can't. Why? Let's put another timeline down. According to the Islamic traditions, now everything I'm going to say comes from their tradition. This is not me saying that. I didn't make it up. You'll see that everybody that I'm going to name. Has anybody studied Islam before? Done a course on it? No one here? Okay, you're going to be our expert, okay? You're Abdul, all right? Just be Abdul for me. And just say yes to everything I say, okay? Be a good Muslim, be good, obedient. All right, Abdul, isn't it true, according to you, according to Islam, that Muhammad dies in 632, right? Yes, sir. Right. So obviously someone was there to record that, right? The Salafi, the Sahaba should be there, the companions of the Prophet. Just say yes. But where do we get the story from? There are no Sahaba. We don't know of any Sahaba. In fact, let's go, and the person you should be telling me about is Ibn Ishaq. That's the man who actually writes it down. There's his name. Do you see the date that he died? Yes, sir. Do you have a problem with that? 765? Do you think he knew Muhammad? If he died in 632? 130 years later? I don't think so. So already you're starting to see a problem, are you not? The rest of you? But see, we have nothing from Ibn Ishaq. There's not a word, not a letter, not a page written by Ibn Ishaq that I can give you. So where do we get the story of Muhammad? We get it from this guy, Ibn Hisham, 833. 833, that's 200 years after the fact. Where did Ibn Hisham get his material from? Was he there? No. Did he ever live in that century? No. He got it from Ibn Ishaq according to what the introduction says. If you open up the page of the story of the Sirah of Muhammad, you will see that it gives the story that Ibn Hisham was not even a student of Ibn Ishaq. He lived 70 years later. He took what Ibn Ishaq said, what he didn't like, he threw away and only wrote what he liked. Is that how you write a biography? More than that, notice another one who wrote one of the Sirahs is named Al-Waqidi. Al-Waqidi didn't even look at Ibn Ishaq, and all he talked about were the raids, the invasions that Muhammad did, and he died in 835. But that's not what Muslims go to. They don't go to to Ibn Hisham or Al-Waqidi to know how to walk, talk, eat, and drink. To know how to live your daily life 24/7, you need to go to the traditions, the Hadith, the sayings, what Muhammad said. And those are the much larger genre of material. So let's get rid of Ibn Ishaq since we know nothing about him. We'll just throw him out. The person to do that, the Hadith you need to go to is this man here, Al-Bukhari. Al-Bukhari is the arbiter of what Muhammad said. He is the most authoritative. That's why they call it Sahih Bukhari, means without error. He is without error. But look at the date he died, 870. Did he know Muhammad? Absolutely not. But there are 5 other compilations of hadith that come immediately after him. You have Sahih Muslim, died in 875. You have Tirmidhi, died in 884. You have Ibn Majah, died in 887. You have Abu Dawud, who died in 899. And you have An-Nisai, who died in 915. Look at all their dates. Those are their death dates. And when you hear these names, and when Muslims hear these names, they never put dates to them because they don't want you to see the dates. I'm putting the dates there so you can see them. And I'm putting them on a timeline so you can see the difficulty. So that's the second genre of what we know as the Islamic traditions, or the standard Islamic narrative, the Sirah and the Hadith. Then we have a third genre and a fourth called the Tafsir and the Tahriq. The Tafsir would be the commentaries on the Qur'an that expound upon it and show you how you're to interpret it. And then the Tahriq would be the histories of all mankind. They were first introduced by this guy here, Al-Tabari, in 923. 923, we're talking about the 10th century. So everything we know about who Muhammad was, what he did, what he said, how Islam began, all these stories surrounding his life, surrounding him going up to the heaven, back down again, getting the 5 prayers, all these stories about who his wives were, all these battles, everything we know comes from 200 years after the fact. Does that bother any of you? That should bother all of you. Because that's based on what then? Since they weren't living at that time, where did they get it from? Ask your Muslim friends. But before you do that, I want to put up this guy here, Abdul Malik. Abdul Malik, we're going to see quite a bit in the next 2 days. Abdul Malik is the greatest of the Umayyad caliphs, and he was in power from 685 to 705. In 692, he introduces the word Muhammad. So, supposedly Muhammad. He is the one, the first to introduce that word. Hugely significant. We're going to talk about that tomorrow because we've now found out something about that word. But he does it on the Dome of the Rock. He introduces it on the inscriptions, on the inner ambulatories of the Dome of the Rock. He also mints coins at that same time, and he introduces it on the coins. I've got some in my bag. He then introduces it on the caliphal protocols. So 3 different genres introduces this God, this man, this title named Muhammad. That's 692. So that's the first time we see this name, right? I'm going to lie, because tomorrow I'm going to show you that's not correct. But this is what Muslims tell us. 692. And I'm going to put these people up because these are the Abbasids. They come to power in 749. They are the ones that eradicate the Umayyads, throw the Umayyads out. The Umayyads, who are headquartered in Damascus, take the headquarters from Damascus, bring it down to Baghdad, and they are the ones that introduce us to the Muhammad of Islam today. The Muhammad of Islam today is for their invention. Now, most of you are probably going to balk at hearing me say that. I can't prove that today. I'm going to have to prove that tomorrow. But I want to put them up there so you see them on a timeline. What does that mean? Muhammad was revealed, the Muhammad of Islam, according to Islam, was revealed 84 years after the Abbasids created him, 141 years after he was first introduced, yet 201 years after he supposedly lived. These are all too late. They're much too late. There's no way in the world that you can trust them if they're that late. Not only that, take a look at where these guys lived. So let's look at this map again. This is a Google map from today. So I put modern day on it so you can all know what countries we're talking about. The Islamic tradition says that everything happens in these 2 cities down here. There's Mecca and Medina down the Hijaz. That's the western part of Arabia. Yet all of the writers of the traditions do nothing down here. They do all their writing up here in Baghdad. That's 1,200 miles away. More than that, Ibn Hisham, who is the one that writes the Sirah, he was born in Basra. He grew up in Cairo. He did his writing in Baghdad. Basra is 1,200 miles away. Cairo is 990 miles away. And of course, as we know, Baghdad is 1,200 miles away. He did nothing way down there. Everything was up in the north. Everything is up in what is today Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. When we get to Al-Bukhari, he comes from Bukhara, which is in Uzbekistan. Look where Bukhara is. It is a good 2,600 miles away. He was born and grew up there, though he did all his work in Baghdad before he died. Al-Tabari, who is the one that's responsible for the tafsir in the Tahriq, he is from what is today northern Iran, in Tabaristan. That is 1,700 miles away. Conclusion, none of these traditional writers lived or worked in Mecca or Medina. They never worked down here. They all worked up here. They were too far to the north of Mecca and came from the west and the east end of Baghdad. Why do you think they were all in the north and they weren't in the south? Anybody have any idea? No idea, right? I'm going to show you how easy this is tomorrow. And it has to do with one word. One word that all of you need. But that's for tomorrow. Note, all of these northern areas are where the Abbasids originated from. That's the Abbasid area where all these guys are from. They only come to power in 749. They continue up until 1299. They are Persian. Their headquarters is Baghdad. It used to be called Ctesiphon. They are the carrier from the Sassanid Empire. So let's continue on. You might say, well, don't we have the same problem as Christians? Aren't we also dependent on oral tradition? Yes, we are. But let's do the same test, because when you look at the New Testament, we have the same genre in the New Testament. The Sirah of Jesus would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The biography of Jesus, what he did would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? For the last 3 years especially. The Hadith of Jesus would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as well. Every time Jesus spoke, many of you maybe have in your Bible, it's written in red letters. That's called the red letter part of the Gospels, right? That's the Hadith of Jesus. The tafsir of what Jesus did would be the commentaries that explain what Jesus said. Paul then took and he wrote them. And so what Jesus said here, he said, this is how you're to work it out in Philippi, and this is how it's to be worked out in Ephesus, and here's how you're to work it out in Corinth, and especially in Rome. So that would be the tafsir of Jesus' teaching, would be the commentaries written by Paul. And as far as the tahriq, which would be the histories of all mankind, that would be the book of Acts, written by Luke himself. The history of the early church. So there's the same exact genre that we're talking about for the Islamic traditions we have in the New Testament. So let's test the New Testament and let's ask the same question. When were the writers of the New Testament actually living? When were they writing? And where were they living? All right? Let's see if we have the same problem that Islam has. So now I'm going to step on some of your toes. In fact, I'm going to step on all of your toes. I'm going to use the most liberal dates I can. I'm not going to use the dates. You're not going to like my dates. But I'm doing it for a reason. I'm doing it so that you can understand just how good it is for our Lord Jesus Christ. So let's look at the Tahriq, which would be the earliest material that we have. That would be the book of Acts, the history of the early church, written by Luke between 52 and 62 AD. So within 20 to 30 years of Christ's death, you already have the history of the early church. Let's talk about the tafsir. That would be Paul's letter. He starts writing within 50 years of Christ's death, between 48 and 65, when he is killed in Rome. That's within 15 to 34 years, you now have the tafsir of Jesus with all the different letters to the different churches. Then we start getting into the gospel accounts, and this is the sirah of Jesus and the hadith of Jesus, both the biography and also what he said. Mark is the first one I'm going to put up there. He dies in 70 AD, so that's within 37 years of Christ's death. You now have the sirah and the hadith of Jesus. That's the first one. Then we get two more that come about 10 years later in 80 AD, written by Matthew and Luke. That's 47 years after Christ's death. You get the second series of sirah and hadith. So now we have three different copies of the sirah and the hadith of Jesus. And then finally we end with John, who has the last sirah and the last hadith. He dies in 90 AD, so within 57 years, which means within 29 to 57 years of Christ's death, the entire New Testament is written down. What's more, and this is so important, all of the New Testament writers lived in the same place Jesus lived. And they either knew him personally or they got the material from others who saw what he did and heard what he said. So our genre of our material, of all of our sirah, the hadith, the tafsir, and the tahriq, all come from within 60 years of Christ's death, all either by eyewitnesses or those who were the eyewitnesses, and all from with the same area that Jesus lived. If we were to use if we were dependent on what Islam has for Muhammad, none of the writers would be down in the area of Galilee. They would all be up in Turkey. And they would all be writing in the 3rd century, redacting it back to the 1st century. Do you see, as a comparative, who has the more authoritative material? When were the earliest biographies saying that for both faiths were written? Christianity, we have our material within 15 to 60 years later, written by those from the same area. Islam is dependent from 200 to 300 years later, written hundreds of miles too far north. Which would you guess is the more authoritative? In fact, if we had to be dependent on what we know of Jesus, concerning what we know of Jesus as the Muslims are on what they know of Muhammad, if we had to depend, let's just read it rather than try to say it. If we had to depend on sources for Jesus comparable to what Muslims are dependent on for Muhammad, Jesus would not begin to appear until the 3rd century. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John would not be living anywhere near Galilee. They would be living all up in what is today Turkey, and they would be living and working in the 3rd century, redacting it back to the 1st century. How in the world would we defend him? I wouldn't know how to defend Jesus. And yet that's exactly what the Muslims have, and no one's taken them to bat for it. No one's going public with this. We've got to hold Muslims responsible for this and say, no wonder you don't know who your prophet is. No wonder you have no idea what he did or who he was or what he said. Now, I just lied to you a few minutes ago. I'm going to shut down everything I just said. I told you that the book that you all are dependent on is this book here. This is the book that actually gives you the biography called The Life of Muhammad. Notice what it says underneath it. and I can hardly read it. The translation of Ibn Ishaq, Siratul Rasulullah. Ibn Ishaq, remember I kind of threw out Ibn Ishaq out, right? Did you notice I threw him out and I replaced him with Ibn Hisham because we have nothing from Ibn Ishaq. We only have it from Ibn Hisham, who died in 833. That's the book you have to read. If you go to any university anywhere in the world, this one's in English, but if you go to any other place where it'll be translated into any other language, that's the biography of Muhammad that you have to live with. That's the one that you have to read. You want to ask where and who, if I don't believe Ibn Ishaq wrote it, then who did write it? Well, to understand that, you need to ask the Germans. And the Germans actually just told me this back in September, so I'm not even noted a year. I had no idea. That book that everybody reads all over the world did not come from Ibn Ishaq. We already know that. It did not even come from Ibn Hisham. There is no manuscript from Ibn Hisham. Nothing from the 9th century. So who wrote that book? Who would you like to have written the book? If Ibn Hisham didn't write it, then who else would you like to have written it? Probably someone who could read and write Arabic, right? Or somebody who got it from those who could read and write. Am I correct? Probably a Middle Easterner, correct? Wrong on both cases. You want to see who actually wrote that book? You want to know when he wrote it? Here he is. That's him right there. His name is Heinrich Ferdinand Wustenfeld, a German scholar living in Berlin in 1858, decided to go to 4 different German universities, going into different libraries, and started plucking out everything he could find on this man named Muhammad, all in Arabic. And in between 1858 and 1860, he then compiled the biography of Muhammad and published it in 1860, and that is the book we read today. Every Muslim around the world is dependent on this German scholar. Before 1860, there was no Sirah of Muhammad. Oh, there were stories about him, floating here, floating there, flowing everywhere. The Germans started collecting them and bringing them back to Germany like all the Europeans did, and they kept them in their libraries for safekeeping, and it was he that finally put it together into a form so that the world could read it. It is only 160 years old. The man who Muslims are dependent on to know who their prophet is or what he did is an elderly German linguist who wrote Muhammad's story 160 years ago, thus over 1,000 years too late. Thank God we don't have this problem with Jesus Christ. Isn't it great that we don't have to hold up to this kind of scrutiny? But hold on. I'm going to now introduce something that that has not even gone up on YouTube yet. This is new material. You're the first to hear it. Actually, no. The Czech Republic heard it 2 days ago. They were the first, so you're the second to hear this. Back in about a year ago, I was really taken to bat by a scholar on YouTube who started mocking me because he was saying, you know, Jay, you have no idea what you're talking about. You're saying that these are all written in the 9th and 10th century, redacted back to the 7th century. Well, let me show you here. Here's Muwatta. I've got it in my hand. Jay Muwatta. This is a man who actually knew Muhammad. He was a Sahafa. I've got his book in my hand. Hey, look over here, Jay. I've got Al-Bukhari. You know this Al-Bukhari? This guy actually knew Muhammad. I've got his book right in my hand. And how dare you say that these are written 9th and 10th century? These were all written in the 7th century and the 8th century. They were all written by people that actually knew Muhammad. And he started taking book after book off the shelf and opening it up and reading the words and also reading the dates. So I decided, well, hold on a minute. That's interesting. I said, what books is he pulling off his shelf, and where did those books come from, and what manuscript did they come from? So I decided to ask my team to do some research. Dr. Pat Anderson especially. This guy is an amazing, amazing researcher. When I ask him to do a few pages, he ends up and sends me 83 pages of written material, and I have to wade through all that stuff. So I wanted to find out exactly when Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, I want to know when the first extant manuscript, that means the first manuscript that we can read today that comes from, that we can attribute to these individuals. Because I assumed that if these individuals wrote it, the manuscript should be there. Because we're only talking about the 9th century, right? That's only 1,200 years ago. Listen, you can get manuscripts for the New Testament that go all the way back to the 3rd and 4th century. We have the Sinaiticus, we have the Alexandrinus, we have the Vaticanus, 3 complete metropolitan codices for the New Testament alone in Greek from the 4th and 5th century. Am I correct? We have over 365 manuscripts of the New Testament alone that are partial. Not all of them are full, from before the 6th century. Am I correct? If we have such a treasure trove of manuscripts, and remember, the only reason we have these manuscripts is because they were written on vellum, they were written on parchment. Before that, we were all dependent on papyrus before that, and that's why we don't have the gospel accounts, because they were written on papyrus, which are nothing more than these interlocking leaves that disintegrate after 100 years because they dry up and they just crinkle. That's why we don't have the originals for that reason. But by the 4th century, by the time Constantine finally officiated the Council of Nicaea and commissioned those 50 documents, those 50, which the Sinaiticus and the Alexandrinus are probably 2 of, that was all written on parchment. Why? Because you need animal skins to write on parchment. Animal skins are very expensive. Gazelles are very expensive. Just the Sinaiticus, the one that's there in the British Library, that took 62 gazelle skins just to write that one codex. See, now the Muslims can't make that excuse because they were never dependent on papyrus, because these were caliphs that were commissioning all these books. And the caliphs always used parchment. They always used animal skins because they were wealthy enough to do so. So I wanted to find out where these extant manuscripts are. There should be manuscripts by Ibn Hisham, at least in the 9th century, and Al-Bukhari in the 9th century, and Sahih Muslim, and Ibn Dawud. There should be some from Al-Tabari, right? And the Muwatta, those are even earlier. They should also be from that time period, right? Well, you're going to see something that's not gone up on YouTube yet. This is yet to go up. Let's just see what we have found. So let's see where these manuscripts are, these extant manuscripts. Let's start with the Hadith. These are Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim. These are the sayings of Muhammad, right? Written by Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Dawud, Najah, and Naif. Every one of them are the 6 major Hadith writers. All were living in the 9th and 10th century. Where would you think the first manuscripts come from? Well, you would hope the 9th century. Abu Dawud, 10th century, 100 years later. Sahih Muslim, 11th century, 200 years later. We have nothing earlier than the 11th century for Sahih Muslim. Ibn Majah, 11th century. We have nothing earlier than the 11th century for his. An-Nasai, 12th century, 300 years later. Jami' at-Tirmidhi, 13th century. That's 400 years after the fact. Sahih Bukhari, 14th to the 15th century. That's 500 years later. Folks, do you see the problem with that? None of these come from the men that they are attributed to. These are all nothing more than attributions. Now let's talk about the Muwatta, the ones that are supposed to be even earlier, the ones that he was taking off his shelf and was mocking me with. Let's look at those manuscripts and let's see where they come from. So let's go to the other side. Companions of the Prophet. These are all supposedly written in the 7th century. The Muwatta itself, that's the earliest manuscript that we can come across for any of the Islamic tradition. It was written in the 9th century. That's 200 years after the fact. The Sahifa Ibn Munabi is from the 12th century. That's 500 years too late. The writings of Hanbal from the Hanbali school are from the 13th century. That's 600 years too late. The Musannaf, which is supposedly something written by one of the companions of the Prophet, it was written in the 13th century, that's 600 years later. And Tailisi, the 13th century, 600 years later. And Abi Shaiba, that's the 13th century, 600 years too late. Not one of these are from the 9th and 10th century, except for the Muwatta. Every one of them come from the 11th, 12th, 13th, all the way up into the 15th century. These are mostly Ottoman writings, redacted back onto these men. Not one of them is from the time period that they say they are from. This is yet to go up, folks. This is going to be this is going to be a great one when we put it up. These documents were all supposedly created in the 7th to 9th century, yet they do not even begin to appear until the 9th to the 15th century, from 100 to 600 years too late. This proves that they were all written by others hundreds of years after the fact. Written by other people, not the men they're even attributed to. These are nothing more than attributions, much like the Gospel of Thomas. Gospel of Thomas, supposedly written by Thomas, we now know it was written hundreds of years later. Or the Gospel of Barnabas, the ones the Muslims like to use the most, written by Barnabas. It was written in the 16th century, redacted back to Barnabas in the 1st century. Thank God we don't have this problem. Now, can you understand then the dilemma for the 21st century scholars? Concerning these late dates, and I'm not just talking about the 9th and 10th century, I'm talking about the 11th, 12th, and the 15th century. Islam, as we know it, they say, did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Qur'an probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. Conclusion, the history of Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik and before, is a later fabrication. And you can see then why they are concerned. These are the scholars concerned. If so much of Islamic history was created so late, then why in the world did it take so long to write it down? The answer they come back with is because they were illiterate at that time. No. Listen, by the time that Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali come to power, they now controlled all the way from over here, Libya over here, all the way to Afghanistan over here, from Turkey up here, all the way down to Yemen in the south. Are you telling me that nobody in these cities of Baghdad or Damascus or Jerusalem or Cairo or Basra or none of these places had anybody that could read or write? What about the libraries in Alexandria? Wasn't there a library that was burned down in the 5th century? What's in the library if they're not books? Of course they could read or write. And don't the Muslims tell us that the Quran was written down by the secretary of Muhammad named Zayd ibn Thabit? Yeah. Who is Zayd ibn Thabit? He was a secretary. What do secretaries do? They write, do they not? So you can see, of course they knew how to read and write. And we're going to see that tomorrow, just how hopeless they knew how to read and write. So it's obviously that there was something wrong here. There was nothing written down. There should have been everything written down. Obviously, these are way too late. Therefore, they cannot be trusted. They're much too late. 200 to 300, now I'd even say 5 to 1,000 years too late. So therefore, since they are so late, we need to go back to the period when they were written down. We need to go back to the 7th century. We need to go back to this time period. I'm not interested anymore in the 9th and 10th century or the 11th or 12th century. Don't waste my time. That's what I'm telling Muslims anymore. I don't want to talk about these men. I want to talk about the 7th century. You need to come back to the 7th century. Let's talk about that place and let's talk about that time. And to do that, we need to do it with the material that is for the 7th century. So, what we're going to do then, starting tomorrow, because I say I only have a few minutes left, we're going to do that with Mecca. Wait till you see what we now know about Mecca. We're going to have fun with Mecca. So tomorrow morning, we're going to ask the question. Since we cannot trust any of these scholars who have written about Muhammad, where he came and what he did and what he said, why don't we go back to the 7th century and ask, well, what about the place he came from? Why don't we go back to Mecca? Let's go back to that place in the middle of the desert, just below Medina, just below Taif, about 35 miles in from the Red Sea. Let's go to that place and see if it existed. What do you think, or what would you suggest from what you know now? I haven't said anything yet about Mecca. How many here think that Mecca did exist in the 7th century? Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4. So the 4 of you, 5. Mecca did exist in the 7th century. Now, when I hear a Muslim put his hand up, the first thing I say is, oh, come tomorrow and prove to me that he existed in the 7th century. Show me one reference to it. All right? So you have 24 hours to do it. You have 12 hours to do that. Come back in 12 hours, and I want the 5 of you raise your hands to show me one piece of evidence that Mecca existed. All right? Are you ready? Ready to do that? And there are some material out there, and I hope you find it. Let's see if Mecca did exist. The rest of you, I assume you have some doubts now, or you just don't like raising your hands. How many of you believe it did not exist? Let's put your hands up if it did not exist. Okay, can you prove that? But tomorrow you will.